Pierce Brosnan, 4 decades standing under the Hollywood lights, an icon of elegance and composure that the whole world cannot deny. A man who redefined the perfect image in the public eye, where every gesture was precise, every look was controlled, and every step radiated unshakable confidence. From the image of a cool, refined James Bond, who never faltered in the face of danger, to roles that carried deep inner emotion, he conquered the brightest stage on the planet with his calm demeanor, natural charm, and a presence that seemed never to collapse. Millions admired him as a symbol of strength, of control, and of a life where everything seemed perfectly arranged. But behind that image was a story not told by the lights, not captured on film, but existing in the long silences that stretched throughout his entire life. A childhood that was not whole when his father left the family very early, leaving a gap that no explanation could fill. A mother forced to leave to make a living in a foreign land, leaving him to grow up in the absence of the love he should have had. Those years of feeling lost, where he did not belong anywhere, was not seen, was not heard, only quietly existing like a shadow in the flow of life. Then, when he thought he had finally found a home, a love big enough to erase the old gaps, life took that woman away in the cruelest way. And it did not stop there. Many years later that pain returned, stealing another part of his heart, repeating the same wound he had never had time to heal, not once, but twice. The same kind of loss, the same feeling of helplessness when standing before things that could not be changed, and deep within it all was a silent fear he had never named, that the things he loved most were always the things most likely to leave him. And now, at the age of 72, when the lights were no longer as blinding as before, when the rhythm of life began to slow down and time seemed to shrink day by day, the question was no longer how successful he had become, but how he had survived all of that, in the shadow of fame and memories that had never truly rested. Before stepping further into the story behind that spotlight, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so we can together explore the truth he has kept hidden for many years. It is not just an act of support, but also a way for you to respect a man who has silently endured losses the world has never seen. Born in Drogheda, a small town where cold winds from the sea slipped through every narrow street, and life was always tied to simplicity that bordered on harshness, Pierce Brosnan did not enter this world with the protection of a complete family, but with a very early, very deep silence, as if from the beginning life had already lacked an important part. His childhood days were not covered with laughter or warm embraces, but with prolonged deprivation, where every meal, every piece of clothing carried the mark of hardship. But what hurt him was not what he lacked materially, but what he had never truly had emotionally. His father left when he was too young to understand what it meant. There was no explanation, no goodbye, only a quiet disappearance, leaving behind a gap that could not be named. For a child, that absence was not just losing a person, but losing the feeling of being protected, of belonging. He grew up without clear memories of his father. Only a silent question that followed him through the years, asking why someone could leave and never come back. When his father disappeared, his mother became everything, but life did not allow her to stay. To survive, she was forced to leave Ireland for London to work, leaving her young son behind as part of a sacrifice no one wanted to mention. And so, before he could even understand what a family was, he had to learn how to live in an incomplete family. Not abandoned just once, but twice in different ways, but leaving the same feeling. He was sent to live with his maternal grandparents in a house that was not his own, with people who tried to love him with everything they had, but still could not replace the presence of his parents. Mornings began in silence, meals without laughter, days passing while he learned not to ask, because he gradually understood that there were questions that would never have answers. There were children who grew up with guidance, with hands leading the way, while he grew up by finding his own path in a world he did not fully belong to. The feeling of being left behind did not come loudly, was not a storm, but a persistent rain, slowly soaking into every thought, every emotion, every way he saw himself. He did not rebel, did not resist, did not seek attention. He simply stayed silent, as if he had learned very early that enduring was the only way to exist. That silence followed him as he grew, becoming part of who he was, a shell that the world would later call composure, the demeanor of a man who always controlled his emotions. But behind that shell was a child who had never truly felt he belonged anywhere. When he looked at other families, other children being held by the hand, hugged, called home, he just stood there, observing, like someone outside the story. He did not say it, but he felt very clearly that difference. And that very difference caused him to form a very quiet fear that the things he could love would one day also leave him. The years living with his grandparents were not without love, but it was a love that could not fill the initial gaps. He learned how to adapt, how to exist, how not to place too many expectations on the presence of others. And in that adaptation, a part of him gradually formed, a part that would later help him stand firm through greater upheavals, but also the part that made him always carry a sadness not easy to name. That childhood did not end with a big event, but stretched like a silent crack, unseen by anyone but always present. It did not disappear when he grew up, did not fade when he left Ireland, but went with him everywhere, slipping into the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he feared losing what he had just gained. And perhaps it was from a childhood like that a child learned to stand alone before learning to walk with others, and that would shape his entire path ahead, even when the world began to see him as an icon who could never be hurt. The following years in Pierce Brosnan's life had no clear turning point, no moment big enough to change everything, but only the continuation of the gaps that had existed before, quietly but persistently, like a flow that never stopped seeping into every part of who he was. As he grew up, he had no guiding hand, no one who truly showed him who he should become or where he should go. Other children could find answers in family, in conversations, in advice that seemed simple but was enough to shape an entire future. As for him, he learned how to exist in that absence, feeling his way step by step, piecing together the scattered fragments of life without any guarantee that he was heading in the right direction. The feeling of not belonging was not a passing thought, but a prolonged state, present in every day, every situation. Whether in Ireland or later when he moved to London, he still carried the feeling of standing outside, observing the world more than truly living in it. There were crowded rooms that still felt silent to him, conversations he did not know how to join, not because he did not want to, but because he had never learned how. The lack of connection came not only from circumstances, but gradually became part of who he was, a natural shell formed to protect him from being hurt again. He did not open up easily, did not trust easily, and did not know how to rely on anyone. Instead, he learned to rely on himself, not because he was stronger than others, but because he had no other choice. Those days were not loud, had no big events, but they were the most deeply shaping period. His inner world was built from long silence, from thoughts not shared, from emotions with nowhere to go. He observed more than he spoke, thought more than he expressed, and gradually that silence became inseparable. The outside world might not notice, but inside he always carried a light vigilance, an invisible distance between himself and others. In all of that, art appeared as something different. Not immediately, not like a clear calling, but as a refuge he gradually found. At first, it was only curiosity. Short moments when he saw something that made him pause longer than usual. But then, over time, it became the only thing that allowed him to feel he was truly existing. When drawing, when observing, when trying to express something through images or emotions, he no longer felt separated from the world. It was the first time he could express things he could not say, not with words, but in another way, a way he understood, a way he could control. Art did not solve the loneliness, but it made that loneliness more bearable, gave it shape, made it less vague. It gave him a reason to continue, an anchor in a life where many things were still unclear. And while others found connection through family, through friends, through relationships, he found it in moments alone, when he could be himself without needing to explain, without needing to prove. But even then, the silence was still there, not leaving, only changing form. It was no longer complete emptiness, but became part of the way he saw the world, part of the way he felt everything around him. Those years did not bring him certainty, but they brought something else, an ability to endure that not everyone had, a resilience that did not come from strength, but from having grown used to having nothing to lean on. And perhaps it was from those unprotected days that a man gradually formed, not loudly, not stand out, but deep enough that later, when he stepped into the light, he would not be completely swept away, because he had lived in the darkness long enough to understand it. Those early years when he first set foot in London were not a hopeful new beginning for Pierce Brosnan, but more like the next step in a journey that had already lacked stability from the start, where everything felt foreign and there was no guarantee he would find his place. That big city did not welcome him with opportunities, but with the coldness of crowded yet indifferent streets, where everyone was busy with their own lives and had no reason to stop for a young man with no name, no clear direction. He did not arrive in London with a specific plan, with no one to guide him, no solid foundation to rely on, only a vague feeling that he needed to keep going, even though he did not know where. Life quickly became a series of struggling days, where every penny had to be calculated, every opportunity was fragile and could easily disappear before he could grasp it. The jobs he took did not bring stability, only enough to survive a little longer. Sometimes he did manual labor. Sometimes he took small, odd jobs no one else wanted, with no guarantee for tomorrow, no clear path ahead. There were days he woke up not knowing what he would do, only knowing he had to continue because stopping meant having nothing left. In all of that, the thought of acting began to appear more clearly, not as a romantic dream, but as the only possibility that made him feel he could become something different from his present. But that path did not open easily. Auditions followed one after another, cold waiting rooms, glances that passed over him and then forgot, all forming a tiring, repetitive cycle. He would step in, give everything he had, then step out with the same result. Silence. No explanation, no feedback, only the familiar disappearance of opportunity. Just like so many things in his life had disappeared before. No one said he was not good enough, but no one said he was good enough either. And it was that very gap that made everything heavier. He had no point to hold on to, no sign that he was getting closer to what he wanted. Others around him seemed to have clearer directions, more confidence, while he still stood there in the middle of a huge city, trying to find a position that seemed not to exist. There were times he wondered if he was chasing something not meant for him, if these years of effort meant anything at all. Those thoughts did not come once but repeated. Every time a door closed, every time an opportunity passed without leaving a trace. He was not the only one rejected, but for him, each time carried its own weight, because it touched the old feelings of not being chosen, not being seen, not being kept. There were afternoons he stepped out of an audition room, walking among the crowd where no one knew who he was. No one cared what he had just been through, and he realized the world kept going without needing him. That feeling was not new, but in this situation it became clearer than ever. Life did not stop to wait for him to find his way. He had to find it himself or be left behind. There were moments he stood before the choice to give up, not because he was weak, but because he was too tired of trying without seeing results. The thought of returning to a simpler, more stable life appeared like an escape. No more waiting, no more facing closed doors, no more wondering what he was doing there. But every time that thought appeared, it came with something else, a feeling that if he gave up, he would return exactly to the place he had tried to leave from the beginning, a life with no direction, no clear meaning, only repeated existence day after day. And so he continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he was not ready to accept that he would never have the chance. Those years did not bring him fame, did not bring him recognition, but they forged something else in him, an ability to keep moving forward even when there was no guarantee ahead. And it was precisely in those days when life kept saying no that he gradually learned how to move forward without needing anyone's approval. After the years when every door seemed to stay closed, Pierce Brosnan's life finally opened a small crack, not big enough to change everything right away, but enough for him to feel for the first time that he was not completely invisible. The role in the series Remington Steele came to him not like a brilliant dream, but like a rare opportunity after countless rejections, an opportunity he did not dare take lightly because he knew too well the feeling of having nothing. When he stepped into that role, he was not just acting, but trying to prove that he deserved to stay, deserved to be seen, deserved to have a place in a world that had ignored him for too long. And for the first time, everything began to change. His face appeared on screen, his name was mentioned more often, and the people who once passed over him now began to stop. Not everything changed immediately, but it was enough for him to feel something he had waited for many years, that he was finally stepping out of the shadows. That success did not come with noise, but it carried a very deep meaning, because it was the first time he was no longer the person standing outside the story. However, just when he began to believe that everything was gradually stabilizing, that the years of effort were finally leading to something concrete, life once again reminded him that nothing was certain. When his name began to be mentioned for the role of James Bond, it was not just a career opportunity, but the biggest dream any actor could ever think of. It was the icon, the peak, the door that could completely change his life. And this time he was not as far away as before. He was very close, close enough to clearly see the door opening in front of him. But then, when everything seemed within reach, it was taken away in a way he could not control. Contract obligations, decisions not in his hands, all combined to pull him away from the position he had almost touched. There was no big mistake, no clear failure, only an opportunity disappearing right when he thought he had it. That feeling was not like the previous rejections. Before, he had not been close enough to feel the loss clearly. But this time he was right at the threshold, and having to step back from there carried a different feeling, heavier, deeper, as if the dream was not just delayed, but pulled out of his hands when he had already believed it belonged to him. There were moments he had to face a truth that was not easy to accept, that even when he did everything right, even when he had been persistent, had tried, had overcome so many difficulties, it still did not guarantee he would get what he wanted. Success, he realized, was not a straight line, but something fragile that could appear and then disappear without warning. What he had just achieved with Remington Steele no longer felt as solid as before. It was not the destination, but only a temporary step in a journey still full of uncertainty. He did not return to the starting point, but he also did not move as far as he had hoped. And it was precisely in that in-between space that he learned something no one could have taught him before. That being seen did not mean being kept, and getting close to the dream did not mean the dream would become reality. But he did not stop, not because he did not feel the loss, but because he had grown too used to continuing even when there was no guarantee ahead. This time, the disappointment did not send him back into silence as before, but made him understand his path more clearly. It was not stable, not predictable, and certainly not fair, but it was his path, and even though the dream had been taken away right before his eyes, he still kept moving forward, not with certainty but with something else, a resilience formed from all the times life had said no before. After all the times he seemed to have touched something, only to have to let it go, Pierce Brosnan's life did not suddenly change in a loud or brilliant way, but quietly opened another door, a door that did not lead to fame immediately, but led him to something he had lacked for nearly his entire life, the feeling of belonging. He met Cassandra Harris toward the end of the years when everything inside him was still unstable, when his career was still uncertain and the gaps from the past had not yet been filled. It was not a destined meeting in the usual romantic sense, but a slow, natural connection, as if two people carrying their own wounds had found each other at a time when both needed something more solid. In Cassandra, he did not just see a woman, but a feeling he had never had before, a feeling of peace, a stability he did not need to struggle to hold on to. She did not love him for the image the world had not yet seen, but for the person he was, with all the imperfect parts, the parts he usually hid behind silence. And that was exactly what made him gradually lower the shell he had carried since childhood, not immediately, but enough to begin believing he did not always need to stay in a defensive state. As the relationship grew, it brought him something he had never had, a family, not an abstract concept, but concrete things. Mornings waking up knowing someone was beside him, meals with conversation, moments when silence no longer meant loneliness. He did not just become a husband, but also a father when he welcomed Cassandra's children as his own. That did not come from obligation, but from a very real desire. The desire to build something he had never had, a home he could protect and not let slip away. Those years were not perfect, but they brought a feeling he had never experienced before, the feeling of stability. After all the unstable days, the rejections, the periods of not knowing where he was going, he finally had a place to stop, a place to return to. Life was no longer just about struggling to exist day by day, but began to have more meaning, more purpose. He no longer thought only about himself, but about family, about the people who depended on him, about how to keep everything from falling apart like before. And in that change, something else gradually appeared, a belief he had never dared to have before, that perhaps this time he had found where he belonged. Not a perfect place, not a life without difficulties, but a place real enough that he no longer felt he was standing outside. The memories of childhood did not disappear. The old gaps were not completely filled, but they no longer took up all of who he was. Instead, he began to build new memories, things that could gradually replace what had been lost. He was no longer the child left behind, but a man trying to make sure his family did not have to go through the same thing. There were ordinary evenings with nothing special, but for him they carried deep meaning because they were moments he had never had before. The laughter, the small stories, the things others might take for granted were, for him, proof that life could be different. And it was in those years that he began to believe everything had changed, that what he had gone through before was only part of the past, that the future could be more stable, more certain. He did not know that life still held greater challenges ahead, but at that time, the most important thing was that he had found a place to stand firm, a place that was no longer temporary, a place he believed he could stay. And for the first time in his life, he was not just existing, but truly living. But Pierce Brosnan's life had never been a straight enough path for him to stand still too long in that feeling of peace. And just when he began to believe he had found a place to stay, a home solid enough that it could not be taken away, everything changed in a way he could not prepare for. The news came without noise, without warning, without any sign clear enough for him to avoid it. Cassandra Harris, the woman who had given him the first feeling of family in his life, was diagnosed with cancer. A single word, but enough to collapse everything he had just managed to build. At first it did not feel like a final conclusion, but like something distant, a possibility he hoped would not become reality. But very quickly, everything became clearer, more concrete, and there was no longer room for denial. His life changed almost immediately. Plans, intentions, career efforts suddenly became secondary, even unimportant. Everything narrowed down. revolved around one single thing: how to keep the woman he loved here a little longer, how to stretch time in a battle where he understood very clearly that he could not control the outcome. He did not abandon his career completely, but he no longer pursued it with the same focus as before. Instead, he spent most of his time beside Cassandra, not as an actor, not as someone building a name, but as a husband, as someone trying to do everything he could for the person he loved. Those days had no big drama, no clear moments to name, but were a long chain of small changes, little by little, but enough for him to realize that everything was gradually leaving him. He watched Cassandra change day by day, not in the way natural time brought, but in the way illness forced it to happen. Things that had once been very normal became more difficult. Moments that had once been full of energy became shorter. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, heard the weakness in her voice, felt the distance gradually forming between the person she had been before and the person she was now. And what hurt him the most was not that change, but the fact that he could not do anything to stop it. He could stay beside her, could take care of her, could say words he hoped would bring comfort, but he could not change the direction of everything. There were long nights when he stayed awake beside her, listening to every breath, as if being there, not leaving, was the only way he could keep everything from slipping away too fast. There were silent moments when both understood but neither spoke, because speaking meant accepting what neither was ready to face. The fear of loss did not come suddenly but grew over time, with every small sign, with every change he could not ignore. It was no longer a distant possibility, but a reality moving closer every day. And in all of that, he began to realize that the feeling he had once had as a child, the feeling of being left behind, was returning. But this time it was clearer, more painful, because this time he understood exactly what he was about to lose. He was no longer the child who did not understand, but a man looking straight at an outcome he could not change. Memories of childhood, of absence, of the gaps, did not disappear, but seemed to be stirred up again, as if life was repeating something in a different way. But this time he was not standing outside, not helpless in a passive way, but right at the center of everything, feeling every moment pass with a clarity he could not avoid. There were days he tried to keep everything normal, tried to maintain the habits, the small things that could create a feeling of stability. But even in those moments he still knew everything had changed. There was no way to go back to the time before that news appeared. No way to return to the life he had once believed he would have. And it was precisely in that period that he had to face a truth he could not avoid: that there were things in life that could not be kept. No matter how hard he tried, he did not give up, did not leave, did not try to escape, but stayed, day by day, hour by hour, doing everything he could, even though he knew the final result was not in his hands. And it was in that staying, in that unconditional persistence, that a part of who he was became clearer than ever. Not the image the world saw, but the real person, the man who did not walk away even when he knew he would have to lose everything. Then that day also came. Not noisy like what people usually imagine about big endings, but quietly, heavily, like a door closing without sound, leaving behind a gap too wide to name. And in that moment, Pierce Brosnan understood that there were things in life that could not be postponed forever. That all the effort, all the persistence, all the hope he had held on to throughout that time ultimately could not change the outcome. Cassandra Harris passed away after a long battle with the illness that had gradually taken away parts of her. And when that moment happened, it was not just the end of a life, but the collapse of a world he had struggled so hard to build. There was no way to prepare for it. Even though he had known it was coming closer, even though he had seen the signs beforehand, even though he had lived in that fear every day, when it actually happened, it still carried a weight that nothing could lighten. He was no longer the husband fighting alongside his wife, but became someone left behind, facing a silence he could not fill. The woman who had given him the first feeling of family, who had helped him believe life could be different, was no longer there. And with her, A part of him also disappeared, not in the physical sense, but in a way he could not name, but always felt. The days after that were not clear, had no specific boundary between day and night, between present and memory. He continued to exist, but no longer felt he was living in the way he once understood. Everything around him still happened, but no longer held the same meaning as before. The rooms became larger, the silences longer, and everything seemed to lack something he could not replace. The feeling of emptiness did not come suddenly but spread slowly, taking over every part of his life, from the smallest things to those that had once been very important. He did not just lose Cassandra, but lost the feeling of a home, a place he had once believed he could stay in forever. And in that loss, a familiar feeling returned, a feeling he had known from very early in life, the feeling of being left behind. But this time, it was different. This time he understood clearly what he had lost, understood clearly the gap it left behind, and that very understanding made the pain deeper, clearer. He was no longer the child who did not understand, but a man who had to face the truth that the things he loved most were no longer there. There were moments he tried to find a normality again, tried to continue the things he had once done, but everything carried a different shade. Memories did not disappear, but became clearer, as if they were trying to fill the gap the present could not. He remembered the small things, the habits, the conversations, the moments he might not have thought much about before, but now became irreplaceable. And in all of that he began to realize that the life he had once known had ended, and another life had begun. A life without Cassandra, without the feeling of a complete family as before. He did not collapse in a way others could see, had no clear signs of breakdown, but inside, everything had changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn, as if a part of him had returned to the old state, the state of someone standing alone, not relying on anyone, not expecting anyone to stay. But this time that silence was not just a habit, but the result of a loss he could not deny. People around him could see him continue, could see him still working, still appearing, still keeping his image. But they did not see the gaps he carried, the moments he faced, the absence of someone who had once been the center of his life. And it was in those gaps that he had to relearn something he thought he had overcome. How to live without family beside him in the way he had once known. Not completely alone, but without the feeling of being kept, of belonging. And perhaps what hurt the most was not the losing itself, but having to continue living afterward, having to find a way to exist in a world that had changed without any guidance, without any guarantee that he would find something similar again. And from that moment, his life stepped into a different phase. A phase where the light still existed, but no longer brought the same feeling as before, because the most important part was permanently no longer there. After the day when his world collapsed in silence, Pierce Brosnan's life did not stop, did not give him time to truly stand still and understand everything he had just lost, but continued to push him forward in a way he could not refuse. The opportunities he had waited for over many years finally arrived, and this time they were no longer at a distance as before. He was chosen to become James Bond, a role that was not just a career milestone, but a global icon, an image built through many generations and carrying the expectations of an entire industry. When he stepped into that role, he did not just step onto a bigger stage, but into a world where every eye was on him, where every gesture, every word was observed, analyzed, and remembered. From an actor who had once struggled to be seen, he became a face the whole world recognized, a man tied to perfection, to strength, to the ability to overcome every challenge without showing any sign of weakness. But even in the moment he achieved what many saw as the peak, another truth became clearer than ever, that what happened on the outside could not change what existed on the inside. Fame came, recognition came, praises, opportunities, all appeared at the same time, but they did not touch the deepest part of who he was, where the pain still remained intact, where the loss had never been resolved. He learned how to appear in public with a consistent image. A confident, calm man who controlled everything around him. But that was only part of the story. The rest, the part no one saw, was a person still carrying gaps that could not be filled. His life gradually divided into two distinct parts. One part was the image the world saw, where he was the icon, the character millions admired, the man who always stood firm in every situation. The other part was the real person, where he still faced memories that could not be erased, the absence of Cassandra, the feeling that even though he was in the middle of the light, a part of him was still held back in the shadow of the past. The days working on set, the public appearances, the moments when he was honored, all happened in a rhythm he gradually became familiar with. But when everything ended, when the lights went out and no one was looking at him anymore, he returned to a different reality, a reality without applause, without praise, only silence and thoughts he could not avoid. Success, he realized, was not an ending point, but only another state, a state that could cover many things but could not change the nature of what had happened. He could be seen by millions of people, but that did not mean he felt understood. He could stand at the center of attention, but that did not mean he no longer felt alone. The roles he performed, the characters he embodied, sometimes gave him a way to temporarily step away from himself, to live in another world where everything could be controlled according to the script, where endings were always clearer than reality. But when the roles ended, he still had to return to his real self, to things that could not be rewritten, could not be edited. Some people looked at him and saw a perfect journey, a story of overcoming difficulties to reach success, but they did not see the rest, the part not told, the part with no specific images to illustrate. And it was that part that defined who he was more than any role. He did not deny what he had achieved, did not downplay the value of his career, but he also understood that it could not replace what he had lost. There were moments he stood in the middle of everything he had once dreamed of and still felt a gap that could not be explained, as if there was a part of him that could not fully step into that world. And it was in that separation that he continued to live, continued to work, continued to keep the image the world expected, not because he did not feel, but because he had learned how to exist alongside what he carried. Success did not bring the peace he had once thought, but it brought something else, an ability to keep moving forward without needing to resolve everything immediately. And in that continuation, he gradually understood that life did not always allow healing before moving forward. But sometimes people could only carry what had happened and learn how to live with it. Between the days when the lights still shone on the outside but inside, there were still dark gaps that could not be filled. Pierce Brosnan's life once again changed in a quiet way, not loud like fame, but deep enough to touch the part of the person he had tried to keep hidden for a long time. He met Keely Smith at a time when he was no longer searching for anything, no longer placing expectations on starting over, because, after everything that had happened, he understood clearly that love did not only bring happiness, but also carried the possibility of loss. That meeting did not come as a replacement, did not aim to fill the gap Cassandra had left, but happened like a natural appearance, slow, without force, without demands. Keely did not step into his life as a solution, but as a separate person, with a presence, gentle enough that he did not feel pushed too quickly away from what he was still carrying. At first, he did not open up completely, not because he did not want to, but because he no longer knew how to do it without carrying caution. What he had been through made him understand that love was not something certain, that anything he cherished could be taken away without warning. And because of that, every step forward in this relationship carried a carefulness he had never had before. He no longer loved in a completely unconditional way as before, but kept a part of himself, as a way to protect himself from having to face the same pain again. But Keely did not demand that he change immediately. She did not try to pull him out of the past, did not force him to forget what had happened, but stayed, little by little, giving him time to adjust on his own. And that very patience created something different, a space where he could begin to trust again, not by forgetting the fear, but by accepting that it was still there. The days together were not always easy, not because of big conflicts, but because there were things not spoken, but still present. There were moments when he paused, thought more than usual, not because the present had a problem, but because the past still influenced the way he felt everything. This time love was not an explosion of emotion, but a slow process of building. Step by step, layer by layer, as if he was relearning something he had once known but had forgotten how to do. He learned how to share more, even though it was not always easy. He learned how to let someone else step into the space he had once kept only for himself. And more importantly, he learned how to accept that loving someone always came with the possibility of losing them. But that did not mean he had to refuse love. Keely did not replace Cassandra, did not erase the memories, did not make the pain disappear, but she brought something else. An opportunity for him not to live completely in the past. Gradually, he began to feel again the things he had once thought he had lost forever. The feeling of being beside someone, of sharing ordinary moments, of building something not based on fear, but on real presence. But even then, the fear did not disappear completely. It no longer controlled everything as before, but was still there, as a part of who he was, reminding him that nothing was permanent. And perhaps it was the very existence of that fear that made this love different. It was not something obvious, but a choice, a decision made every day, that even knowing it could be lost, he still chose to stay, still chose to trust, still chose to open up. And in that process, he did not become a completely different person, but became a deeper version of himself, a person who understood more clearly the value of what he had, because he knew the feeling of losing it. This love did not erase the past, but helped him live with it in a different way, not as a burden, but as a part of the story. He was still continuing to write, day by day, step by step, not certain but real. After the days of learning how to open up once again, Pierce Brosnan's life gradually stepped into a period that on the outside seemed more stable, but inside still carried layers of emotion that never completely disappeared. And it was in that fragile balance that he and Keely Shea Smith decided to go further, not as a rushed step, but as a natural continuation of what they had built together. They got married not only to confirm a relationship, but to create something clearer. A family he had longed for long before he knew how to name it. Becoming a husband once again no longer felt foreign, but was also no longer as simple as before. It came with the clear awareness that happiness was not something that could be kept forever, that anything he cherished could change, and because of that, he entered this marriage with a deeper appreciation, but also with a caution that no one except him could fully understand. When their children were born, life began to take on a different rhythm, a slower, more concrete rhythm, tied to the simple things he had not had the chance to experience before. Mornings no longer began with work or worries about the future, but with small sounds in the house, footsteps, voices, moments when he could see a family existing right in front of him. He no longer lived only for himself, but lived in a structure where each person had a place, had meaning, and that brought him a feeling he had once thought he had lost forever. The peaceful moments were not always grand, did not need special events, but came from very small things, meals together, simple stories, days when nothing happened but still brought a feeling of completeness he had not known in the years before. But even in those moments there was something always present. Not clear, not loud, but enough for him never to forget. The worry about loss. It did not appear as a specific thought every day, but lay somewhere in the way he looked at everything, in the way he cherished every moment, as if he was always aware that what he had was not obvious. He did not speak it out, did not let it become part of daily life, but it was there, like a background he could not separate from. When he looked at his family, he did not only see the present, but also saw the possibility of change. of things he could not control. And because of that, the happiness he had was never completely certain. Not because it was weak, but because he understood too clearly that life did not always keep what we love. That did not make him distant, did not make him stop loving, but on the contrary made him love in a different way, a deeper way, more careful and more conscious of the value of every moment. He no longer saw happiness as something obvious, but as something that needed to be preserved, not by control but by real presence. There were days he looked around and realized he had built a life he had not dared to think of before. A family, a stability, a feeling of belonging. But, at the same time, he also knew that it did not erase what had happened, did not make the past disappear, but only created a new layer on top, a layer he could stand firmly on even though underneath there were still cracks. And perhaps it was in that awareness that his life became more real, not perfect, not certain, but enough for him to continue, enough for him to believe that no matter what happened, what he had was still worth cherishing. But there are memories in life that never truly disappear. They only retreat, hide deeper, waiting for a moment to return in a way that cannot be stopped. And for Pierce Brosnan, that moment came not as a completely new shock, but as something so familiar that he could not deny it from the very first second. When his daughter Charlotte was diagnosed with cancer, the world around him did not collapse immediately like before, but inside him everything seemed to turn back, returning to a time he had once gone through, once witnessed, once endured. No one needed to say it. No time was needed to understand. He recognized right away what it meant, not because he was pessimistic, but because he had been there before, had stood in a similar room, had heard similar words, had seen signs that others might not fully understand, and that very familiarity made the pain heavier, because it was not just a new event, but the repetition of something he had never truly overcome. Memories of Cassandra Harris did not return as faint images, but clear, sharp, as if time had not passed at all. Hospital rooms, cold lights, long silent moments all appeared again, not as the past, but as the present. He was not only facing Charlotte's illness, but also reliving a part of his life he had once thought he had left behind. The only difference was that this time he no longer held the hope that everything could go in a different direction. He did not say it out loud, did not let it become a statement, but deep down he understood clearly that he was facing the same fear, the same path, the same outcome he had once witnessed. And that was exactly what forced him to face a feeling he could not avoid, the feeling of helplessness. Not helplessness because he did not try, but helplessness because he knew there were things not within his power. He could stay beside her, could take care of her, could say words he hoped would bring strength, but he could not change the course of the illness, could not decide the outcome, could not make everything stop at the point he wished. There were days he tried to keep everything normal, tried to keep the family from being swept into fear, but even in those moments he still felt a silent waiting, a feeling that the worst was not something that could be avoided, but something moving closer every day. He did not talk about it, did not share it in a clear way, but it was present in the way he looked at Charlotte, in the way he spent time with her, in the silences that needed no words. There were times he looked at her and saw not only the present, but also the past, layered on top, saw what had once happened, saw what might happen, and that very awareness made every moment heavier, more meaningful, but also more painful. He was no longer in a state of blind hope, but he also did not give up. He existed in an in-between space, where he both tried to hold on to what remained and prepared for what he did not want to accept. The days passed not quickly, but stretched out, each day carrying a tension no one could fully see. There was no clear point to say that everything had changed, but he felt it in the smallest things, in the changes only those close by could notice. And in all of that he had to face a truth he could not avoid, that life not only repeated, but sometimes repeated in a way that left people without enough strength to believe everything would be different. But he still stayed there, still continued, not because he believed he could change the outcome, but because he could not do anything else except stay. And perhaps it was in that staying, in facing the fear without running away, that the person he was tested once again, not by something new, but by something too familiar, to the point where there was nothing left to say except continuing to watch it happen day by day. And then what he had quietly been waiting for, what he had never wanted to name, finally happened in the way he had witnessed before. No different, no lighter, no easier to accept. And in that moment, Pierce Brosnan not only lost his daughter, but was pulled back to a time he had once thought he would never have to go through again. Charlotte passed away after a long battle with the illness he had become too familiar with. A battle he had once stood on the side of, once hoped, once waited, once tried to believe that this time it might be different. But in the end, the outcome did not change. There was no surprise in the ending, only the heaviness of knowing it would happen, but still being unable to stop it. And that was exactly what made the pain not come as a shock, but like a slow, deep, prolonged wave that pulled him into a state he had once experienced. But this time, everything was clearer, deeper, because he understood too well every step of this journey. He did not need anyone to explain, did not need anyone to say that it was unfair, because he had stood in that position before, had once lost someone in the same circumstances, the same illness, the same feeling of helplessness. And having to go through it again was not just a new loss, but the repetition of an old wound that had never truly healed. There were moments when he did not know what he was feeling. Not because he had no emotions, but because everything felt so familiar that no words were enough to describe it. The pain was no longer something new, but had become part of reality, something he had to face without being able to change. Silence gradually replaced every reaction, not because of a lack of emotion, but because there was nothing left to say. Words of comfort, the phrases people usually use in such situations, no longer carried the same meaning as before. He did not seek explanations, did not ask why, because he knew there was no answer that could make it easier to accept. He just stayed there, in the silence, in the gaps no one could fill. Losing Charlotte was not only losing a daughter, but losing a part of the life he had tried to protect, tried to hold on to after everything that had happened before. And losing her in the same circumstances, in the same way, made everything heavier, as if life was repeating something he could not escape from. He did not collapse in a way others could see, had no clear signs of breakdown. But inside, everything became quiet in a different way. A quiet that did not bring peace, but carried acceptance. Not easy acceptance, not acceptance without pain, but a form of acceptance that came from understanding that there were losses in life that could not be avoided, could not be changed, could not be negotiated. He no longer tried to fight against it, no longer hoped that things could be different, but learned how to live with the truth that the things he loved most could leave without any way to keep them. The days after that had no clear change, no specific moment to say he had overcome it, because he did not overcome it in the way people usually think. He continued to live, continued to exist, but with a deeper understanding of life, of the fragility of everything, of the fact that nothing was certain. There were times he remembered, not as a way to hold on, but as a part of accepting that those memories would always stay, irreplaceable, not gone, but also unable to bring back what had been lost. And it was in that parallel existence, between memory and present, that he continued to move forward, not because he no longer felt pain, but because he had learned that there were pains that did not disappear. They only changed the way they existed in him. And perhaps what was hardest was not the losing itself, but having to continue living afterward, having to find a way to exist in a world that had changed without any guidance, without any guarantee that he would not have to go through something similar again. But he still stayed there, still continued, not because he was stronger, but because he no longer had any other choice except to keep moving forward, carrying everything that had happened, not leaving it behind, not forgetting, but letting it become a part of who he was, a part he could not separate from, whether he wanted to or not. After everything that had happened, after the repeated losses to the point where they could no longer be named with a single word, Pierce Brosnan's life did not stop, did not allow him to close everything like a story that had ended, but forced him to keep moving forward in a reality he did not choose but had to accept. He did not leave the world, did not disappear from the lights, did not let go of what remained, but continued to live, not in a gentle way, but in the way of a person who understood that stopping was not a choice. Family was still there, no longer whole as before, but still the only thing keeping him connected to the present. The reason that made him wake up every day, even on days when he did not know what he was moving forward for. With Keely, Shea Smith, and the remaining children, he was not just a man who had gone through loss, but a husband, a father, a support they still needed, and that very role forced him to continue, not because he was ready, but because he could not let everything collapse one more time. The pain did not leave, did not lessen over time in the way people usually hope. It did not disappear, did not fade, but stayed, changed shape, slipped into every part of life, became an inseparable part. He did not try to forget, because he understood that there were things that could not be erased. Instead, he learned how to live with it, not as something that needed to be overcome, but as a part of who he was, a part he had to carry whether he wanted to or not. There were days when he felt everything became heavier, memories returned more clearly, gaps appeared more sharply, but he did not fight against them, did not try to push them away, but let them exist, as a way to keep what had been lost, as a way not to forget that those people had once been here. His life did not return to what it was before. There was no point where he could say everything had become completely stable. But he no longer searched for perfection. He no longer searched for a state without pain because he knew that did not exist. Instead, he searched for small moments, things enough to continue, enough to keep life from becoming completely empty. There were mornings he woke up and nothing special happened. But that very ordinariness carried a deep meaning because he knew it was not something obvious. He held firm to his role in the family, not by showing strength in a clear way, but by presence, by being there, by not leaving. He did not always speak out what he felt, did not always share everything, but he was there, and sometimes that alone was enough. His strength did not come from not feeling pain, but from still continuing even though the pain remained intact. He did not need to prove that to anyone, did not need to show it on the outside, because it was not an image but a process, a journey that only he truly understood. There were times he looked back, not to regret, but to realize how much he had gone through, how firmly he had stood before things many people could not imagine. But he did not see it as a victory, did not call it complete overcoming, because he knew what had happened was still there, still a part of him, and would always be. He did not try to become someone else, did not try to change himself to fit any image, but accepted himself as he was, with all the cracks, the gaps, the parts that had never been filled. And it was in that acceptance that he found a different kind of strength. Not loud, not clear, but enough for him to continue. Life did not become easier, did not become fairer, but he no longer expected that anymore. He just continued, day by day, step by step, not because he had no choice, but because he understood that continuing was the only way to keep what remained from being lost. And perhaps it was in that uninterrupted continuation that the person he was became defined more clearly than ever, not by what he had achieved, but by the way he had stood firm when everything around seemed to have nothing left to hold on to. And when looking back at that entire journey, Pierce Brosnan's life was no longer a series of milestones measured by success or fame, but became a long flow of losses, times of standing up, and silences that not everyone could see, because if people only looked at what he had achieved, they would easily believe this was the story of a perfect man. An icon who never wavered, an image built from control and victory, but the truth lay somewhere else, deeper, less spoken about, where what defined him was not the lights, but what happened when the lights went out. His life was not a smooth journey, not a path with clear guidance, but a chain of events he did not choose, losses he could not prevent, from a childhood left behind, to the years of feeling lost while searching for a place, to the time when he thought he had found a home only to watch it fall apart in a way no one could prepare for. He did not just lose one person, but lost many times, in different ways, but leaving the same gap, a gap no success could fill, no fame could replace. And what made that journey different was not that he had overcome everything in a perfect way, but that he had never truly overcome it completely. He only continued to live with what had happened, carrying it as a part of who he was, not trying to deny it, not trying to erase it, but accepting that it would always be there. When the world looked at him, they saw a James Bond, an image of invincibility, of confidence, of a man who always knew what he was doing. But what they did not see was the real person behind that image. A man who had stood many times before moments with no script, no solution, no way to fix. He did not become an icon because he was never hurt, but because he still stood firm, even though he had been hurt many more times than people could imagine. His legacy, therefore, did not only lie in the roles, not only in the films, not only in the awards or recognition, but in the way he existed through all of that. The way he did not let the losses define him in a negative direction, but turned them into a part of the strength he carried. He was not perfect, not invincible, not immune to pain. And that was exactly what made his story closer, more real. Because it reflected something many people felt but could not always express. That life was not about avoiding suffering, but about continuing to live even though suffering was still there. There were moments in his journey with no clear ending, no complete resolution, no point where he could say everything had returned to before, because in reality they never returned to before. They only changed, and he changed along with them. He learned how to look at life not as something that needed to be completely controlled, but as something that needed to be accepted. With all the uncertainty, with all the possibilities he could not predict. And it was in that acceptance that he found a form of peace that was not the absence of pain, but the ability to exist with it, without being overwhelmed by it. As time passed, as the years continued to stretch, his image in the public eye might not change much. Still the elegant, calm man. But inside he was a person who had gone through so much, had learned so much, not from success, but from what he had lost. And perhaps what people always sensed, but never truly knew, was exactly this, that behind that calm was a strength that did not come from never falling, but from standing up without anyone seeing, from continuing to move forward without needing to prove anything to anyone. He did not tell his story in a grand way, did not turn it into a symbol of endurance, but lived it, day by day, in the small things, in the choices he made, in the way he held on to what remained and did not let it slip away one more time. And when everything was looked back at, what remained was not a story of perfection, but a story of a human being, of a man who had gone through things no one wished for, who had lost what was most important, but still stayed, still continued, still existed, not as an untouchable icon, but as a real human being, with everything that meant. Looking back at Pierce Brosnan's entire journey, what makes people unable to help but feel heartbroken is not how much he has lost, but the way those losses repeated in a cruel and patterned manner. From a childhood left behind when his father walked away and his mother had to go to London to make a living, to the moment when he thought he finally had a complete home with Cassandra only for cancer to take it all away. And then, many years later, that same tragedy returned when his daughter Charlotte passed away in almost exactly the same way, as if life was not only testing him once, but repeating the same wound to see if he could still stand firm. What is worth noting is not that he did not collapse, but that he was never truly healed completely. He still carried that pain when he rose to the peak with the image of James Bond. still continued to live, love, and work, while inside he was never at peace. It is precisely that contrast between the perfect image on screen and the real person full of wounds in life that has made his story deeper and more thought-provoking than any success. For American society, where success is often measured by fame and achievements, this story reminds us that true strength does not lie in avoiding adversity, but in the way a person continues to live when nothing is certain, the way he still held the role of husband beside Keely Smith, and father for his family even after going through irreplaceable losses. The lesson is not to become invincible, but to learn how to exist with the wounds, to cherish what you have while you still can, and to understand that sometimes simply not giving up is already the greatest form of victory a human being can achieve. If the story about Pierce Brosnan made you think, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate a man who has silently endured losses that no one saw. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore lives that seem brilliant but hide many things that have never been told.